I didn't think it was going to be anything special. It was just another stop on a long road trip, one of those budget motels you find just outside a small town, the kind that looks like it hasn't been updated since the 80s. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes heavy, and the clock ticked well past midnight when I pulled off the highway and into the parking lot of the Crescent Moon Motel. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked pavement. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning from the office and the distant croak of frogs in a nearby swamp. The place was almost deserted, save for a few cars parked along the row of rooms. The reception area was a small, dimly lit office with a thick wooden counter. A woman, probably in her late 40s, greeted me. Her name tag said Margaret. Her smile was strained, like she didn't see many guests, let alone at this hour. "Room for the night?" she asked in a voice that was a little too sweet for my liking. "Yeah, just one night." "How much?" She told me the price, which was shockingly low. I figured the place was probably a dump, but I didn't mind. At that point, I was more interested in a bed and some sleep. After paying, she handed me a key that looked like it was from the 70s, the kind you can tell has been passed through 1,000 hands. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I should've. As she handed it to me, she paused, almost as if she was going to say something, but then stopped herself. Her eyes flickered toward the door behind her. I didn't follow her gaze, but I noticed her expression shift, like she was suddenly uncomfortable. "Room 7, she finally said, almost whispering. "It's down the hall, on the left." I smiled politely, nodded, and grabbed my bag before heading out of the office. It was cold, colder than I expected for a summer night. The parking lot was quiet, too quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I made my way to room 7, I noticed how rundown the place looked. The walls of the building had peeling paint, the windows were filthy, and a few rooms had their doors slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness. I reached the door to my room and inserted the old brass key into the lock. It clicked open, and I stepped inside. The room smelled musty, like stale air in something else, something metallic. The bed was unmade, the sheets wrinkled, and the carpet was stained in places I didn't want to investigate. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was late, I was tired, and I just wanted to crash. As I closed the door behind me, something caught my eye. There, on the nightstand beside the bed, was a small, old-fashioned lamp. It wasn't plugged in, but what really made me stop was the photograph lying next to it. It was a black and white picture of a young girl. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring right at me. Her smile was unsettling, too wide, too perfect. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I picked it up, feeling its cool, aged surface. No name, no date. Just the girl. I set it back down quickly, trying to shake off the unease settling in my chest. I turned on the lamp, trying to focus on something other than the picture, but it didn't help. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, the walls pressing in closer as the night grew colder. As I lay down on the bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. Something was watching. Something, waiting. I tossed and turned that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the oppressive silence of the room seemed to get louder. The clock on the nightstand ticked so loudly it felt like the minutes were stretching into hours. But it wasn't just the clock that was making noise. There was something else. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a creaking floorboard, the faint whisper of wind outside. But then I heard it again. A soft tapping, almost like nails scraping against wood. It came from the walls. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The tapping wasn't rhythmic. It was erratic, like something or someone was moving inside the walls. It wasn't an animal either, it was deliberate, methodical, like it was trying to communicate. I sat up in bed, my eyes scanning the darkness of the room. The faint glow from the lamp cast long, jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper. I reached over and grabbed my phone, hoping a little light would ease my anxiety. But the moment I turned it on, I heard the tapping again, this time louder, more persistent. It was coming from the wall directly behind the bed. My hands trembled as I held the phone up to the wall, half expecting to see something clawing at the surface. I stood up and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it. The tapping stopped. My breath hitched in my throat. I waited a few moments, but nothing happened. I pulled away from the wall, trying to convince myself that I was just exhausted, maybe even hallucinating from the long drive. But the unease stayed with me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself to just lie back down and sleep. But as soon as I crawled under the thin, scratchy blanket, I heard it again. A faint sound, like whispering voices, but they weren't in the room. They were coming from inside the walls, too. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking the tone. It was low and guttural, like someone was trying to speak from the other side, but couldn't quite form the words. I rushed to the window and threw open the blinds, hoping for a distraction, maybe just the fresh air to calm my nerves. Outside, the parking lot was still empty, and the night was as quiet as before. But something caught my eye, an old figure standing in the distance, near the edge of the lot. A man, his features obscured by shadows. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and he stood perfectly still, as though watching the motel. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. I turned back to the room, my skin crawling. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I thought about going to the office, but something told me it was better not to involve Margaret. Something about her felt off, too. I'd already gotten that strange vibe from her when I checked in, and I didn't want to give her any reason to treat me like I was paranoid. I picked up the photograph from the nightstand again. The girl's wide, unnerving eyes stared up at me. Her smile, that twisted grin, still felt like it was mocking me. The tapping from the wall resumed. But now it wasn't just tapping. It was something, scratching. Something scraping against the wood, as if it were trying to break through. I couldn't take it any longer. I threw on my shoes, grabbed my bag, and rushed out of the room, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had to leave. I rushed out of room 7, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The hallway was just as quiet as the room had been, too quiet. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like I was walking through a veil of dust and forgotten memories. The flickering lights above only added to the eerie atmosphere, casting long shadows on the cracked tile floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking in the darkness beyond. I turned back, glancing at the door to my room. It was still shut, but it felt like something, or someone, was waiting for me on the other side. My mind raced with thoughts of escape. I could leave the motel, get back in my car, and just drive. But then, I remembered the man I had seen outside earlier. The figure who had been standing in the shadows near the edge of the parking lot. Where did he go? My pulse quickened as I realized that maybe leaving wasn't the best option. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening in this godforsaken place. And so, I decided to head for the office. Maybe Margaret would know something, or at least, I hoped she would. I moved quickly down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty silence. The walls seemed to close in on me with every step, and the temperature dropped the further I went. When I reached the end of the hall, I took a deep breath and knocked on the office door. No answer. I knocked again, a little harder this time. Still nothing. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, against my better judgment, I twisted it and pushed the door open. The office was dark, the only light coming from the glow of a small desk lamp. But Margaret wasn't there. The office was empty, save for a few chairs and a cluttered desk. The faint smell of stale coffee hung in the air. But something was off. I stepped into the room, scanning the space. That's when I noticed it. A small, wooden box sitting on the desk, partially hidden behind a stack of papers. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong in a motel office. It was old, too old, and the wood was dark, almost blackened with age. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled countless times. Without thinking, I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the box, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. A cold chill ran through me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I pulled my hand back, but the box was already in my grip. It felt like it was pulling me, like it wanted to be opened. I could hear the faint sound of scratching again, this time louder, like something was clawing at the inside. I set the box down quickly, my hands trembling. The noise from the walls, what was it? Was it coming from here, too? I had to leave. I had to get out. But just as I turned to go, I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. I froze. Margaret stepped into the office, her eyes wide with alarm. Did you touch that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer her. There was no way she could know I'd touched the box, unless. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the box, her face drained of color. "You have to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." I didn't know what she meant, but the fear in her eyes was enough to convince me that something was horribly wrong with this place. It wasn't just the strange noises, the old photographs, or the weird figure I saw in the parking lot. There was something in the walls, something in the motel itself, something that had been here for far longer than anyone should have ever known. I had to get out. Margaret's voice trembled as she stepped back, her eyes never leaving the box. Her entire demeanor had changed in an instant. Gone was the kind, if a little odd, receptionist. Now, she looked like someone who had seen far too much and was desperately trying to keep it all from spilling out. "Please," she whispered, almost pleading. "You have to leave. It's not safe here." I couldn't move. The air in the room felt thick and oppressive, and the silence between us was unbearable. I looked at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was she scared of the motel? Of the box? Of something else entirely? "What's going on here, Margaret?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What is this place?" Her eyes flickered toward the box, then back at me. She took a slow, shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Do you know what this place was before it became the Crescent Moon Motel?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent. I shook my head. No, I didn't even think to ask. She looked at the door as if making sure no one else was listening before she stepped closer to me. "This place was a boarding house, many years ago. Long before it was turned into a motel. But something happened here. It's been here ever since." I didn't understand what she meant by "something happened," but I could feel my stomach tightening as she spoke. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, the flickering light casting strange shapes on the walls. "The walls," she whispered. "They've been here since the beginning. They hide the things that came with the house. Things that were never meant to be found." I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean, things?" Margaret's face went pale, her eyes wide with terror. "There's something in the walls," she said, her voice shaking. "It's been trying to get out for years. It's never left. That thing you heard, the tapping, the scratching. It's been there for as long as anyone can remember." She grabbed the box from the desk, holding it in both hands, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "This box is the key. It's the only thing keeping it contained. We thought it was safe, but it's not. Every time someone opens it, every time someone touches it, it gets stronger. The tapping gets louder. It starts to wake up." My mind raced as I tried to process her words. This was madness. I looked at the box again. The scratching inside was louder now, almost frantic. The thing in the walls was alive. It was real. And I had just made it stronger by touching the box. I turned toward the door. I have to get out of here. You said it's not safe. What is it? What's in the walls? But Margaret wasn't listening. She was staring at the box, her face twisted in a mix of fear and something else, guilt, maybe. Her hands trembled as she held it, and her voice dropped to a whisper. You don't understand. It's too late. It's already out. Just as she said that, the lights flickered and went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. The air was suddenly cold, bone-chilling cold. My breath came out in visible puffs as I tried to adjust my eyes to the blackness. Then I heard it. The scratching. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from everywhere. Suddenly, the walls themselves seemed to shift. The sound grew louder, closer. It was as if the building was alive, breathing with a life of its own. The room felt like it was shrinking, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving toward me. The air seemed to thicken, like it was pressing against my chest. I could feel something brush against my shoulder, and when I turned, no one was there. A sudden shriek pierced the silence, followed by a low, guttural growl. Margaret let out a terrified scream and dropped the box. It hit the floor with a dull thud, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, the door slammed shut. I was trapped. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the force of it sending a shockwave through my chest. I tried the handle, but it was locked. Panic rose in my throat, choking me, as I pounded on the door. The scratching grew louder. Now it wasn't just the walls. It was in the floor, in the ceiling. It was everywhere. I turned around, trying to focus on my surroundings. The darkness pressed in on me, but I could still hear Margaret, her ragged breathing coming from somewhere in the room. She was on the floor, her face twisted in terror as she clutched the box to her chest like it was a lifeline. Margaret! I shouted. What's happening? What is it? But she didn't respond. She was staring at the walls, her eyes wide, pupils dilated with fear. Her lips trembled, and she whispered something under her breath, something that made no sense, a string of words that didn't belong together. I couldn't stay in that room. I had to get out. But the sound of the scratching, the growling, the feeling of something closing in on me, it was all too much. Then, just as I turned back to the door, the air went still. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything fell silent. But it was the kind of silence that felt like the calm before a storm. I looked at Margaret, but she still hadn't moved, her face frozen in horror. And then I saw it. A figure, emerging from the shadows in the far corner of the room. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as it moved closer, the dim light from the desk lamp revealed a grotesque, twisted shape. A humanoid figure, but not human. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its skin was an unnatural shade of pale gray. Its face was gaunt, eyes wide and bulging, mouth open in a grotesque grin that seemed to stretch beyond what was natural. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but it didn't matter. It was too late. The thing, whatever it was already upon me. Its limbs creaked as it moved, like old wood bending under pressure. I glanced back at Margaret, but she hadn't moved. She was still staring at the box, her body shaking as if she were caught in some kind of trance. The thing was right behind me now, its breath cold on the back of my neck. I could feel the weight of its presence, the darkness wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. I turned to face it, but it was no longer just one figure. There were more, dozens of them, emerging from the walls, from the shadows. They were crawling, moving, reaching out with long, twisted fingers that scraped the floor. I felt something grab my ankle, and before I knew it, I was yanked to the ground, the cold, clammy hands of the creatures dragging me toward the wall. My heart raced as I struggled, kicking and fighting, but they were too strong. Their fingers dug into my skin, and their eyes, those wide, bulging eyes, stared into mine with a mixture of hunger and malice. But then, from somewhere in the chaos, I heard Margaret scream. She was standing now, the box in her hands, her face contorted with guilt and fear. She stepped forward, holding the box out in front of her. The creatures paused, their heads turning toward her as if they sensed something. "It's the box," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The box holds it back. It keeps them contained." I didn't understand. How could a simple box do this? But as I looked at her, the box in her hands seemed to glow faintly, a strange energy emanating from it. But it wasn't enough. The creatures were too close now. They were pulling me toward the wall, their hands digging into my flesh. I screamed in pain, feeling the cold grip of death tightening around me. Suddenly, the box slipped from Margaret's hands. It hit the floor with a soft thud, and the creatures rushed forward. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it was over. But then, as the creatures swarmed toward the box, something unexpected happened. The glow from the box intensified, and with a deafening roar, the creatures let out a horrible screeching sound, their bodies contorting in agony. I didn't know how, but I found the strength to scramble to my feet. The creatures were writhing on the floor, their bodies convulsing, as if the box was pulling them back. Margaret's eyes met mine, wide with terror, and for a brief second, I saw the regret in her gaze. She had known. She had always known this would happen. But it didn't matter now. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran. Out of the office, down the hall, through the dark, empty parking lot. The sound of the creature's screeches echoed in the distance, but I didn't dare slow down. My car was parked at the far end of the lot, but I didn't even care. I just needed to get out. Get away. By the time I reached my car, I didn't look back. I slammed the door, turned the key, and drove out of that place without a second thought. The Crescent Moon Motel was gone by morning. When I went back to check, there was nothing there, no office, no rooms, no parking lot. Just an empty plot of land. But the fear never left me. And as I drive through the nights now, every time I pass a motel, I feel the same unease creeping up on me. Because I know. Whatever it was, it's still out there. It's been months since I left the Crescent Moon Motel, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that room, hearing the scratching, feeling the cold breath on my neck, seeing those twisted figures crawling toward me from the shadows. The worst part? I can't shake the feeling that I haven't really escaped. I tried to put it all behind me. I moved on with my life. I told myself that I'd been tired, stressed, that maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. The truth was too dark, too real to ignore. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is silent and the wind howls outside, I swear I can still hear that scratching. Not from the walls, but from somewhere inside my mind. I didn't go back to that town. Didn't even look at the map again to figure out where it had been. But this past weekend, I drove through the area by accident. I don't know why, I wasn't planning to, but my car just ended up on that old highway again, as if some invisible force had drawn me there. I didn't want to stop, but I did. I drove past the turnoff, the place where the motel had been. Or rather, where it should have been. But there was nothing. Just empty land, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by rusted fences that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The road leading to the motel was completely gone, like the earth had swallowed it whole. I sat in my car, staring at the empty land, my mind racing. Could it be possible? Had I imagined the whole thing? But then, through the thick mist that had rolled in from the nearby swamp, I saw something. A flicker. A shape moving through the fog. My blood ran cold. There, at the edge of the land, just where the motel once stood, was a figure. A man. tall, thin, and shrouded in shadow. His head tilted at that same unnatural angle I had seen the night I first arrived at the Crescent Moon Motel. It couldn't be him. He was the first one I had seen standing in the parking lot, the one I thought had disappeared. But now, he was back, staring at me. I didn't think. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and sped away, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop. Not until I reached the next town, and even then, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I stayed in a cheap motel that night, but I could feel the same tension in the air, that same dread in the back of my mind. The walls felt too close, and every time the wind howled, I thought I heard that scratching. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events of that night in my head, Margaret, the box, the creatures. I kept seeing those eyes, those wide, unnatural eyes, staring at me from the dark. And that man. Why was he still there? Was he part of it? Was he one of them? The next morning, I went back to the location, hoping to see something that would prove I was just imagining things, that it was all a bad dream. But when I arrived, the land was empty, just like before. There was no sign of the man, no indication that anything had ever been there. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'll ever know. But I do know this, it isn't over. It can't be. I've seen it with my own eyes. Whatever was in the walls at the Crescent Moon Motel, it's still out there. And somehow, I know it's still watching me. The question is, what does it want? I should have walked away. I should have stayed far away from that cursed place, from the memories, from the evil that still lingered in the air. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hunting me, something I couldn't outrun. It wasn't just the figures in the shadows. It wasn't just the nightmares. It was the fear that had taken root inside me, the fear that had been planted the moment I set foot in that godforsaken motel. I thought I could bury it. I thought I could move on with my life. But the truth is, there is no moving on. Not when something like that has touched you. I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. So, I drove back. I didn't know why, but I had to go. Maybe I thought I could destroy whatever it was, maybe I thought I could finally put an end to the nightmare once and for all. When I arrived at the site again, it was still as I remembered, empty land, overgrown and desolate. But this time, I wasn't looking for the motel or the parking lot. I was looking for something else. I felt it, deep in my bones, the presence. The weight of something that wasn't supposed to be here. Something that was buried in this place, hidden away by time, by the land itself. It had been waiting for me to come back. And then, I saw it. At the very edge of the land, right where the ruins of the Crescent Moon Motel should have been, there was a single figure standing again. But this time, it wasn't the man from before. It wasn't a shadowy shape. It was Margaret. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. She stood still, her body rigid, like a puppet with its strings cut. And around her, the same figures that I had seen in the shadows at the motel were gathering, tall, thin, twisted things, crawling from the earth itself. I knew immediately what had happened. Margaret had never been the victim. She had always been part of it. She had been the one who had kept the box closed, the one who had tried to protect the motel, but in the end, she couldn't. She had let the evil inside escape. And now, she was trapped in the same fate as all the others who had come before her. The scratching was louder now. The growls were getting closer. The creatures were rising from the ground, their twisted, grotesque bodies moving toward me. I could hear their breath, like 100 voices speaking in unison, their words unintelligible but full of rage. I had to stop it. I had to do something. But what? What could I do to end this? I glanced down and saw it, the box. The same box Margaret had been holding in the motel. It was lying on the ground, abandoned and cracked open. The glow from the box was faint, but still there, still pulsing with the same strange energy. I knew what I had to do. I ran toward it, my heart racing. The creatures screamed in fury as I approached, but I didn't stop. I reached the box, grabbed it, and felt its cold, ancient surface beneath my fingers. The moment I touched it, I felt a surge of power, an overwhelming force, but I didn't flinch. I knew I had no choice. I turned back to face Margaret, and the creatures that surrounded her, closing in on me with every passing second. I held the box high, and I screamed at the top of my lungs, willing myself to do whatever I could to break the curse, to stop them once and for all. The moment I raised the box, the ground trembled. The creatures recoiled, their bodies writhing in pain. And then, with a force that I could feel in my very bones, the air cracked, and a blinding light erupted from the box. The creatures shrieked in agony as the light enveloped them, and with a final, deafening roar, they were gone. The land fell silent. I stood there, trembling, holding the box, surrounded by nothing but the stillness of the land. Margaret was gone. The creatures were gone. The motel, everything, was gone. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been hours, or maybe just minutes. But when I finally lowered the box, I knew one thing for sure, it was over. I had ended it. The curse was lifted. I left the site, never to return. And though the nightmare is finally over, there's one thing I'll never forget. The creatures. The evil that lived in the walls. It wasn't just bound to the motel. It wasn't just a curse on that land. It's still out there. Waiting. And now, it knows my name.